Welcome to the New Books Network.
From Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book, where we assemble scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. I'm one of your usual hosts, John Plotz. So today's topic is a brilliant new book arguing that modern literary study remains anxious about the century-old professionalism that betrays the discipline's relation to its amateur precursor, criticism. That book's subtle genealogy of what it means to be bound by a discipline or to have a vocation, which is quite different from having a salary or what Joseph Conrad called two good addresses. It has immense implications, I think, for how we think about and value humanistic pedagogy and how we understand the function of interpretation, understanding, and delight. Those are all topics I hope we come back to in making sense of literary works as both monuments and documents. The book is Professing Criticism, Essays on the Organization of Literary Study, 2022 from Chicago. And its author, I'm happy to say, is with us today, John Guillory of the New York University English Department, award-winning teacher and scholar, author of numberless influential articles and books that include Poetic Authority, Spencer, Milton, and Literary History, Columbia 1983, and the field-transforming Cultural Capital, The Problem of Literary Canon Formation, which was recently reissued to mark the end of its third decade as a profound influence on how we understand the sociology, not just of literary studies, but of the academy generally. So, John, welcome to Recall This Book.
Thank you, John, for inviting me.
It's a great pleasure. And I'm happy to say that John did not come alone. I'm honored that today's Professing Criticism conversation also includes one of my favorite critical professors, Nick Dames. Hi, Nick.
Hi, John. I'm happy to be the token non-John in this conversation, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's true. Well, we're all here gazing at one another through the smoke today on the Eastern Seaboard. And you can just call out John and you'll be right. So I should say that Nick is the co-editor of the wonderful journal Public Books. He's professor of humanities at Columbia and the author of such prize-winning books himself as Amnesiac Selves, Oxford 2001, and The Physiology of the Novel, Oxford 2007, as well as hot off the presses, a fantastic new book that I recently devoured called The Chapter, A Segmented History from Antiquity to the 21st Century. That's Princeton 2023. So I should say my guests today are both brilliant excavators of questions that may seem arcane, and in fact actually frequently are arcane before their excavation, but that reveal themselves as pressing everyday problems. And so thank you both so much for being here today. And so John, the usual Recall This Book format with a new book under discussion is to invite the author, if he or she chooses, to start by laying out what strikes you as the key questions or key claims of the book.
So the basic idea of the book is implied in the title, Professing Criticism. What I wanted to show ultimately was that that there was something odd, something anomalous about this discipline of criticism, of literary criticism, and that the idea of professing criticism is in some ways a contradiction. That if we look at the longer history of the study of literature, going back to antiquity, where the study of literature meant actually the study of all forms of writing that had any value whatsoever in the perception of readers in antiquity. If you look at that long history, it's only at the very, very end of it in the 20th century that we get something that is professional, that can be called criticism, that has to do specifically with the judgment of literary works, and then following shortly on that in the early 20th century, the interpretation of literary works. So there are lots of ways in which writing and in the larger sense, and literature in much more delimited sense, as I describe it, has been treated over those two millennia. But I was interested in the book in exploring the ultimate and very difficult and maybe even intractable consequences of this dual history in which we have forms of literary study that are not disciplinarized, not professionalized, and in which we have a form of engagement with literature, namely something called criticism that emerged in the 17th century that had, first of all, mainly to do with judging works of literature, but which was taken up in the period between the wars in the university and submitted to all of the procedures and rituals of professionalization, and in consequence of that became a discipline where it had never been a discipline before. So professing criticism is a kind of contradiction and maybe even an impossibility. I'd like to hope that it's not, that it's just an innovation historically, but there are aspects of it, of that internal division between the long history of pre-professional, pre-disciplinary literary study and its disciplinary professional form that continue to trouble us. And the book is really an attempt to engage repeatedly and from different angles and in relation to different areas of the discipline with that tension, contradiction, impossibility of professing criticism.
I'd love to pick up a dyad that you mentioned there, which I was looking at in the last chapter of the book, which is that between interpretation and judgment. You have a lot of interesting things to say about the, professional prestige or importance of interpretation. So like on page 396, you say, we, I guess meaning we scholars, do not like to acknowledge that literary artifacts do not need to be interpreted.
Right.
Yeah. Can you say more about that, about the distinction between interpretation and judgment or interpretation and understanding? Because that seems like one of the really fascinating moves in the book, or fascinating discussions in the book.
Right. So interpretation is a relation to text that we can consider to be very old, in fact, aboriginal. We're always engaged with texts, and particularly complex texts, with an effort to understand them. And that often requires a complicated procedure that comes to be known as interpretation. And interpretation has its own history. But criticism in its origins was not a procedure of interpretation. It was, from its beginnings in the 17th century, all about judgment. And it was only in the 20th century that judgment and interpretation came to converge in a practice, which was the practice of new criticism in the U.S. and practical criticism in England.
That discarding of judgment, though, John, it feels to me, I mean, this is coming out of your analysis, but also just my sense of having been in the profession a while, it's never quite complete. It can't be quite complete, right? It becomes the kind of shadow activity or the secret of the discipline. And I guess I'm sort of wondering if you do think, I assume that there are costs to this, to the severance from judgment, and the fact that is something that's not, I mean, maybe that's changing, and I think that's part of your analysis, is it might be changing at the moment, but it's not professionally respectable, but inevitable, right?
Right. I do think that there are costs. There have been costs for us, and one of the costs, and a number of people are pointing this out now, because we're in a renaissance of judgment in the discipline. It's becoming an activity, again, that people are trying to perform and also to make sophisticated. But the cost of it, we've come to realize, is that interpretation is something that isn't obviously necessary for most readers of literature, as also for consumers of the other arts. It isn't the case that people encounter novels and plays and poems and feel the need after those encounters, after those engagements, to interpret those works, to say what they think in any kind of elaborated way, what they mean. So what's happened then is that literary critics who started out as principally the ones who showed you how to judge, how to make the appropriate determination of the quality of the work. Literary critics have sort of gone off in this other direction and become interpreters, and they've been cut off as a result from the mass readership of literature. Now, this is something, as I say, that's happened to a certain extent in the other arts, with the scholarly disciplines dealing with the other arts. But I think with literature, it's become much more consequential by virtue of the capacity of that break with criticism as judgment. It's become much more consequential as the driver of the separation of mass readership from academic literary critics.
So, John, this might be a distinction without a difference, but is your understanding at bottom that people are still practicing judgment, but only with this super added layer of interpretation upon it, or that they've literally discarded the judgment? I mean, I guess this is another version of Nick's question about what's implicitly still, like what the active implicit judgment is, whether it's still present or it's actually something we need to recover.
Yeah, that's a necessary question.
Yeah.
Right? And it has to be a little bit reformulated, I think, to arrive at the terms I was using in my book, because what I wanted to show was that by the later 1960s, judgment was returning in the mode of not the criticism of the literary work, but the criticism of society. The use of the interpretation of the literary work in order to arrive at a judgment of society. So it was what happened. It was what I call the reassertion of criticism, but the reassertion of criticism with this different end, with this different purpose. So some of that judgment sort of redounded back on literary works, so that it was possible for a number of scholars to judge the literary works themselves as morally and politically objectionable, and to feel that this had to be pointed out in literary work, in the interpretation of literary works, that the interpretation put to the service of judging in some ways adversely literary works, and that's presented us with this perennial problem of when we do talk about literary works in the context of a criticism of society, what do we want to say about the value of literary works themselves in that context? Is the value of the literary work its capacity to disclose aspects of society that need to be judged adversely, or is the value of the literary work its transcendence of those conditions in society that need to be pointed out, condemned, and ultimately ameliorated?
I feel like, John, the way you present it in your book, it's as if this question of judgment and its place becomes also tied into a kind of social psychology of what a literature professor is, right? Or even more a kind of, I don't know, deep psychology of what but I don't know if I have quite a handle on, I mean, even with myself, I don't know if I have quite a handle on what that looks like. Is it that we repress judgment? We are aware of making judgments, implicit and explicit, all the time, but they're not spoken. They're in bad taste, or they're it's something that's professionally unwise.
Reviewers have never lost this capacity to make judgments of contemporary work. And of course, that's what criticism was originally. In the 18th century, when people were writing criticism, they were writing criticism about contemporary work. The assumption always was that if it was ancient, it was good. The problem that we have, I think, is that it's very difficult for us to distinguish between what we do when we judge now, because it's something that we're wanting to do more and more of. And it's part of that whole movement out that we spoke of, Nick, last time, the lateral movement of those who are trained in literary study in the academy out into the internet, where the activity is much closer to reviewing. But it's not exactly reviewing. I think it's something that mixes some aspects of scholarship with aspects of reviewing. And I don't think that a paradigm has especially gelled yet. But I do think that's an interesting new phenomenon, because prior to this, these two things have just pulled apart. Reviewing is where judgment takes place, and it's with reference to contemporary work. Scholarship it is where interpretation takes place, and it can be contemporary and also historical, but it doesn't necessarily involve judgment of the work itself. It involves rather judgment in the transferred sense of judgment of society, the critique of society. That's where we went. But I think we're trying to recover at the present time in these internet sites and these journals like N+1, a capacity to straddle the scholarly and the critical proper domain in such a way as to sophisticate the practice that we recognize as reviewing, and also to bring that practice
your
back
essay
into
on monuments and
scholarship
documents
in
is something
some
we
way.
will find really, really helpful to think about. And I bring it up because the thing that is, at least from where I sit, not being a creative writer, being on the professional critical side of things, the thing that seems missing, would be most immediately missing, would be any investment in history, any investment in the history of forms, the history of national literary traditions. And what it seems like we're confronting a situation where we're not sure what the value of that historical purview is anymore. That's constantly being called into question. So it felt to me like you were trying to offer at multiple points in the book, but particularly in that essay, a way of thinking about the value of history that would be usable for us now and not embarrass us with its naivete or make us feel more conservative than we want to feel, something like that. I don't know, John. John Plotz. I don't know if you got the same thing out of that portion of the book as I did, but it was like I felt like a set of tools. I can use the distinction between monument and document to think about what I want, how I would defend the value of history, and what I do.
For sure, but also, so John, so Nick, you've given the sort of positive spin on the power of that chapter as helping us think about like the recoverability of history. But I also appreciate, John, in that chapter that you kind of, that you want to say that there's a rift here between monumentality and documentality, which is not going to be easily resolved. It's not as if we can plump for, well, let's just go all in for documentality. It's more like we have to keep in mind. I think at one point you talk about potentially infinite documentality and finite monumentality, like that we can appreciate and experience artworks for their capacity for raising understanding, and that coexists with the capacity to document and contextualize and excavate.
Right. Yeah. When I first came upon this distinction in Panofsky, I thought it was a brilliant insight. and explained a lot of things to me. But I also sort of guessed that when I would work this up into a kind of contemporary presentation of the humanities and an attempt to shift the emphasis of humanities discourse from assertions of the value of the humanities, the mission of the humanities, to the object of the humanities. That it was going to be problematic to have this double concept because document is not monument, monument is not document, but everything that we study in the humanities is both monument and document. So, or potentially both monument and document. And I wondered, and of course, my worries were confirmed, as my worries always are, that this was just going to be difficult to assimilate, and particularly the language. Monument has become kind of a disgraced concept, or a concept in which the disgrace of figures from the past is literally embodied. So, I worried that great works of literature, art, music, whatever, would drift into association or even identification with monuments like the monument of Cecil Rhodes, which was in South Africa, that was the initial object of opprobrium in the Rhodes Must Fall movement, which then had a lot of consequences down the line for us, up to and including the Confederate monuments that have been knocked down all over the South and elsewhere, even in the South. Those monuments should never have been put up in the first place. But the word monument, the concept of monument, has another history altogether, in which this narrow use of monuments for nefarious political purposes that you see in the South in the period of Jim Crow, that's an anomaly. If you think about the other contexts, like the context of the quote-unquote monuments men who saved all of that wonderful art from the Nazis during World War II, that's the concept of monument that Panofsky was working with. This is the concept of Yeats, monuments of an aging intellect. So there was for Panofsky a way of taking these two data. You're working always as a humanities scholar with objects that you value in some way, not because they're intrinsically good, but because they're intrinsically memorable, because they constitute our history. And then you have all of the stuff that we bring around those monuments, those objects of memorialization, and use in order to gain insight into those monuments. So you need both. And he saw brilliantly that the objects of humanities scholars shifted around constantly, such that the same object that in one context was a document, functioning as a document, could function as a monument in another context. So I thought that was extremely useful. I don't think that people have taken up on this essay yet. It's there is the problem with the monuments concept, but I think the theoretical problem that lies behind that is the one that you were pointing to, Nick, and I think John as well. That look at these objects over the long term, what are we looking at really? History seems very central, and yet not exclusively history in the sense of past time. And this is Michael Bayroube's trouble in his review of professing criticism with this particular chapter. What he saw as the reduction of humanities to history, and you can see that in Panofsky maybe, but I think a better conception, at least I hope, was the one that I came up with of long time, in which you have past, present, and future, and all objects within that scope of long time are the objects of humanities research, of humanities enterprises. So any object you study in the present may not have historical documentation that you could bring to the study of it, but you are studying it because it's situated in long time, because at some future point, this object will become the monument that you want to invest in and say, this is a valuable thing to invest our time and our research into, because it belongs to this sequence of long time. And so I contrasted it to geologic time, which is human time. Even though we interact so horribly and disastrously with geologic time.
I actually,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I wish we had time. If this conversation could be a series of loops, this would actually be a wonderful time to return back to judgment and to think about the concept of judgment in the terms that you're describing, John, which it's always about the general or the universal concept intersecting with a particular. Like, I mean, I'm really remembering this from Arendt's account of judgment in her response to Kant, but that notion that, you know, when we say judgment, we're not really talking about a Empyrean view from above for all time. We're talking about how does this particular instance, you know, usefully relate to, you know, what general categories do we need to bring to bear on this one object. So the account you're offering here of the aesthetic as helping us think about the one by oneness of our active judgment.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Every instance is different. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to use the example of the Holocaust at the end of the humanities essay, because this is not something that no one would have the slightest defense of, who was a credible human being. But it's a monument. It's a monument. It is something that needs to be remembered and addressed and understood. And how do you distinguish that kind of monument from the kind which is the Mona Lisa? You know, to make them the most iconically monumental of monuments, or anything like that has a kind of seemingly ineradicable substantiality. So if you see what I mean, so the judgment it can occupy this spectrum from the strongest possible affirmation of the value of a monument, of preserving it, to the strongest possible disapprobation, which at the same time posits the necessity of memorialization. We cannot forget the Holocaust, but our not forgetting the Holocaust is different from our not forgetting a monument like the Mona Lisa or King Lear or Joyce's Ulysses, or any number of the cultural monuments that we judge positively.
I mean, one way to put this is, and this is why the your reference to statuary can be really, really misleading in certain ways, or confusing, because what you're referring to with the case of the monument is something that has to be alive for us. And you have a great term to describe the passage of monuments into documents. You call it, at one point you call it stonification, right? That it's where the thing ossifies and it literally turned into a statue. And that's the moment where it ceases to live. Inevitable, right? I mean, inevitable. So there's a Pygmalion aspect to this distinction, I suppose.
It becomes forgettable.
Yeah.
Doesn't George Eliot have a line about the thin music of Samuel Daniels? That we can no longer, if the music isn't thick for us anymore, it's just thin. So
right.
Just a sidebar. I've been very interested in those kinds of monuments that lose meaning for people by virtue of stonification.
Yeah.
And songs that you hear too often, Pachelbel's canon has always been the prime instance for me. And musicians hate it, having to play it because they've had to do it too often, and yet it's unmistakably a wonderful piece of music. But it can be subject to stonification if the process of memorialization is not done right.
So I wish we had time to continue this, but I actually think this is probably a great moment to turn to the final section of our conversation, which is what we call recallable books, where I invite you, maybe Nick, I'll invite you first since you have a different name, to name an older book that those who enjoyed this conversation might also enjoy reading.
So, yeah, and I thought about this, John, and I thought, what would be an older book that is appropriate for the context of the discussion we're just having? And I suspect, I don't know if this counts as one that really needs recalling or not, but the one that comes to mind for me is Cather's The Professor's House.
Oh, wow.
Which for me is still still is the best treatment of what it means to be in the career of teaching something like literature. And one that, contrary to a lot of other books that take this up, it's not comic, nor is it suffused with self-pity. And it's the self-pity now that tends to get, I think, a lot of attention. And there are books like that out there. So it is not to say that it's entirely about the thematics of what it means to be a professor of literature, but that is one of its subjects, and it does so in a way that I think nothing else I know does.
That's great. Well, so John, in order to give you the last word, I'm actually going to piggyback on Nick's, because I was going to recommend Pictures from an Institution, which is it's the comic. It's subtitled as a comedy. So it is, but it's also an attempt to kind of think about the lived experience. Elaine Hadley talks about living liberalism. I guess it's like living professordom or something. What it means to be on a campus and to be, teaching literature, trying to make literature. And it is suffused with the kind of gentleness that I completely agree with you. That Professor's House is a greater work if it comes to judgment. And yet there's something so, like delightful about the tone of Pictures from an Institution. So over to you, John.
Right. I wasn't thinking of a work of literature. I wasn't taking the directive as pointing me necessarily to a work of literature, so I'd have to think about that.
You should take the directive anyway. No, if you were thinking, that's
I was thinking much more in thinking that we would probably get to the issue of professionalization and professional deformation and that framework, that conceptual framework. We didn't get to it. That's all right.
Yeah.
There'll be other occasions for talking about that with you guys or someone else. But the book that I'm always trying to point people toward, and in a way, I'm trying to point people in a direction that's not Bourdieu, because I think people conflate my work too closely with Bourdieu. Actually, I have pretty significant differences from Bourdieu, but the closely related work, which is yet I think very different from Bourdieu, that people tend not to read, is Alvin Goldner's work, The Future of Intellectuals and the Rise of the New Class. And that's where I originally started to think about the issue of the professional managerial class and the possibility of thinking about literary study in the context of the sociology of professions, and particularly the professions as constituting sort of central form of the organization of labor in modernity. And this is something that I think Bourdieu does really, that Alvin Goldner does in a way that's very different from Bourdieu. The same concept, cultural capital, he uses the same concept throughout his little book, and it's just a brilliantly suggestive book. And it was sort of secretly important for many of the chapters in the book, including ones that you might not have connected with it. But it was where I began thinking about where to go with this deliberate disenchanting, to use your term from the event at Columbia, this disenchantment of the profession, the attempt to disabuse literary scholars, literary professionals from the idealizations that we cling to so strongly and don't want to give up. That this was a place to go. This was a place where I got started thinking about these issues many years ago, before I read Bourdieu. So I just feel that I owe to this sociologist of the 50s, 60s, 70s a huge debt that I've never been able to acknowledge because he's been so overshadowed by Bourdieu.
Well, that's great. I look forward to reading the book. I haven't read it. That's wonderful. And we'll put up links to all of those books as well as to other things referenced in the conversation in the show notes. So John and Nick, this peripatetic conversation has really been a great pleasure. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
And the same
Johns.
thanks. The same thanks. So all of you out there listening, whether your name is John or not, the same thanks go to you listening at home. And if you're enjoying this conversation, please do check out the Recall This Book archives on our website. And for all of us at the podcast, I'll just say goodbye for now. Recall This Book is the creation of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. Sound editing is by Kamaya Bagla, and music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy. We gratefully acknowledge support from Brandeis University and its Mandel Center for the Humanities. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please forward it to 5 people or write a review and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.